Red wine didn't just stain his shirt. It marked the moment his world split open. In a ballroom drenched in chandeliers and power, a 67-year-old man stood silent while a retired federal judge used humiliation as a weapon, unaware that the man she was trying to bury already held the matches that would burn her entire empire down. And as the crowd watched him with the cold amusement of privilege, he felt something shift inside him. Not shame, not fear, but the quiet, steady certainty that this was the last cruelty he would ever absorb, because they had mistaken his silence for weakness. But they were about to learn. Some storms don't make noise until they break. If you've ever swallowed humiliation just to keep the peace, if you've ever been betrayed by the people you bled for, stay with me till the end. Some stories don't just reveal revenge. They reveal the moment a good man finally stopped forgiving. Red wine makes a particular sound when it hits fabric, a soft, almost tender splash that lies about the violence behind it. That was a sound I heard when the Bordeaux struck my chest, spreading across my borrowed tuxedo like a slow, dark bruise. It felt cold at first. Then the burn came, not from the wine, but from the 100 pairs of eyes turning toward me in synchronized fascination. A hush rippled across the Bennett Family Foundation's ballroom. Crystal glasses paused mid-air. Forks hovered above porcelain plates. Every polished face shifted toward the man now marked in red, the man who didn't belong. Me. I stood there, 67 years old, hands steady at my sides, as Catherine Bennett performed her scene with the grace of a woman who knew her audience. Oh my goodness, she gasped loudly enough for the chandeliers to vibrate. I'm so terribly clumsy. But her eyes weren't sorry. They were triumphant. In that instant, she wasn't a retired federal judge. She was a queen teaching the help a lesson. And I, whom she believed to be a lowly kitchen worker, was her chosen prop. The stain spread like a wound. Deep red, dramatic, theatrical. A perfect centerpiece for her cruelty. I could feel the chill of it sinking through fabric, through skin, straight into my ribs. But I didn't flinch. If humiliation was what she wanted, she wasn't going to get the flailing, sputtering performance she expected. Behind her, Gregory Bennett paused in conversation with two corporate attorneys, watching with tight, polite amusement. Their daughter, Serafina, adjusted her necklace, pretending not to see. And 20 feet away, God help me, my son stood among a cluster of young lawyers, pretending just as hard. He saw everything. He heard everything. He chose silence. The first cut of the night didn't come from Catherine's words. It came from Daniel's stillness. Security appeared almost instantly. Black suits, earpieces, hands ready to guide the problem out of the room. Because what else would a wine-soaked old man be at such an event but a problem? "Sir, do you have an invitation?" one guard asked, suspicion dripping from each syllable. I reached into my jacket. My fingers brushed a thick manila envelope I'd carried in without anyone knowing, 8 months of proof of my son's theft, before finding the cream-colored card. My name, embossed in elegant gold. I handed it over. The guard's eyes flickered. The question vanished from his face, replaced by confusion, and something else. Uncertainty. He stepped back. Catherine, for the first time that night, faltered. She had counted on the assumption her world thrived on, that wealth could always spot wealth, that status could always smell status, that people like me could only ever be servers, cooks, invisible figures in white aprons. She had assumed she could slap me with wine and walk away untouched. But now the room wasn't quite sure who I was. Judge Patricia Henley stepped closer, eyes narrowing with interest. She recognized the shift. The balance had tilted. Not enough to reveal the truth, but enough to make Catherine's hand tremble around her napkin. "Kitchen help shouldn't mingle with guests," Catherine said then, loudly, clearly, decisively, doubling down on her cruelty like a gambler shoving her last chips forward. A murmur spread. A widening circle formed around me. Faces watched for a reaction, a stumble, a protest, a collapse. Daniel's eyes met mine for half a second. He looked away. That was the moment something inside me stopped breaking and started hardening. I smoothed the front of my ruined shirt, lifted my chin just enough to meet the judge's gaze, and said, with quiet finality, "Thank you for a lovely evening." No bitterness, no fire, no trembling, just truth delivered like a closed door. Because some insults don't deserve an argument. They deserve consequences. I walked toward the exit with slow, measured steps. Not running, not ashamed, simply done. The crowd parted like I was something to be avoided, something that might stain them if they stood too close. Let them whisper, let them watch. None of them knew that I owned a building where half of them worked. None of them knew I held the deed to the law firm Catherine's husband ran. None of them knew that my silence was not weakness, it was preparation. In the parking garage, I sat behind the wheel of my car and simply breathed. Not trembling, not furious, not shattered, just still. I looked at the manila envelope again. Months of watching my son dip his hand into the cash drawers like a man sipping from a private stream. Months of reviewing security footage where he thought no one was watching. Months of realizing that the boy I raised, the boy I loved, had been slipping away long before the Bennett family poured their poison into him. My wife's voice whispered through the years, gentle but firm. Sometimes people show you exactly who they are. Believe them. At the red light outside my restaurant's 5th Street location, I made a decision I hadn't planned to make. Not revenge, not rage, not punishment. Justice. 3 days. They had 3 days left before everything they had built on arrogance and entitlement began to crumble. As I drove past my restaurants, the lights glowing warmly in the November dark, I felt something rise inside me. Something old. Something steady. Something forged in the same heat that built my business from a food truck in 1987. Dignity. They had tried to strip it from me tonight. Instead, they gave me clarity. The wine would dry. The stain would fade. But the memory of their cruelty, my son's silence, would not, and neither would the consequences. People assume betrayal arrives with thunder, explosive arguments, slammed doors, shouted accusations. But the truth is quieter. It slips in like a draft under the door, unnoticed until your bones feel cold. My own betrayal began that way. Small, almost invisible shifts, tiny inconsistencies that I once excused as stress, fatigue, pressure on a young man trying to prove himself. I wanted to believe my son was overwhelmed. I needed to believe it, because the alternative, that he was stealing from me, was a truth I wasn't ready to swallow. It started 8 months before the gala, back when my biggest worry was keeping up with reservations and training new staff. I had built everything with these 2 hands. The diners, the steakhouses, the bistros with their warm wooden booths and copper lamps. 12 locations across the city, each pulsing with the rhythm of a dream that had taken 3 decades to become real. Daniel grew up in this world, not just as my son, but as my legacy. At 17, he was folding napkins beside me. At 20, he handled inventory. At 27, he managed a flagship location, a position I handed him with a pride only a parent can understand. He didn't know struggle the way I did, but I hoped he'd learned integrity. I was wrong. One quiet morning, the first crack appeared, a vendor payment that didn't match the invoice. A small amount, small enough to ignore, but wrong enough to lodge in my ribs. I brought it up gently, not accusing, just curious. Daniel brushed it off. Just a clerical error. Dad, I fix it. I smiled. I believed him. I wanted to. But then there were more. A delivery company claiming late payments I distinctly remembered approving. A cashier's shortage that didn't quite add up. Inventory numbers that wobbled like a drunk trying to walk straight. Still, I pushed the doubts aside. You don't raise a child with love and discipline just to think the worst of him. But suspicion, once awakened, has its own gravity. One night, long after the restaurants closed, I found myself replaying footage from the 5th Street location. Not out of paranoia, at least that's what I told myself, but because I needed answers. And then I saw it. My son, in my office, going through the cash drawer long after closing. His movements weren't frantic or guilty. They were practiced. He pocketed the money with the ease of someone who had done it countless times. I paused the video. My throat tightened. There are moments in life when your heartbeat doesn't feel like your own. This was one of them. I watched the next recording. Then the next. And the next. A pattern emerged. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't desperation. This was routine. I didn't tell him what I knew. Not yet. Not until I understood the full scale of the damage. 3 weeks of quiet investigation followed. Bank records, supplier receipts, payroll logs, Restaurant cameras. Each thread I pulled revealed another knot. Then I found her messages. Serafina Bennett, my son's fiancé, sending instructions, strategies, reminders, little digital nudges pushing him further, deeper, bolder. Don't worry, baby. It's your father's money. You're entitled to it. He'll give everything to charity anyway. Better we take what should be ours. My parents think we shouldn't wait until he dies to live comfortably. Her parents. The same parents who humiliated me at their gala. The same parents who saw my son not as a person, but as a tool for elevation. It all made sense. The sudden distance. The subtle changes in Daniel's tone. The way he carried himself when the Bennetts were around. Shoulders straighter, voice colder, like he had stepped out of my home and into theirs. I wasn't losing him. I had already lost him. The night I finally confronted him sits carved in my memory like a scar. We sat across from each other in my office, the warm light turning the room a shade of gold. His eyes avoided mine, darting around like a trapped animal's. I showed him the footage, the statements, the receipts. Evidence. Truth. For a moment, he looked like the boy I raised, frightened, small, desperate for forgiveness. But then something shifted. His face hardened. His spine straightened. He lifted his chin with the same pride I'd seen countless times on Gregory Bennett's face. It's not a big deal, Dad. Not a big deal. Everyone takes a little. You just never noticed before. I do more work here than you. You're old. This business will be mine anyway. You should be grateful I care enough to handle things. Each sentence was a blade, and he wielded them without hesitation. I realized in that moment, he hadn't been corrupted. He had been reshaped, slowly, intentionally, by the Bennetts and their polished poison. You raised me to inherit this, he said, leaning back. So why are you acting like I stole something? You can't reason with entitlement. It does not bend. It consumes. I stood quietly, not trusting my voice. If I spoke in anger, I would say something I could never take back. But silence that I could control. When he finally stormed out of my office, slamming the door behind him, I stared at the paperwork spread across the desk. 8 months. $87,000. A son who thought he was owed everything. A future daughter-in-law who whispered greed into his ear. And parents who believed anyone outside their circle was disposable. That was the night I filed a report. Not to punish him. Not to hurt him. But to save the man he might still one day become. I never imagined how quickly everything would unravel. How fast the Bennetts would turn. How vicious their retaliation would be. How deep their entitlement ran. By the time the gala arrived, the report was sitting in a folder on an investigator's desk. Anonymous. Impartial. Unstoppable. And on the night Catherine Bennett spilled wine across my chest and called me kitchen help, she had no idea she was humiliating the wrong man. She had no idea that the empire she and her husband built on privilege and arrogance was already cracking at the foundation. She had no idea that her cruelty toward me would be the spark that made justice move faster. But I knew, and as I walked out of that ballroom, wine-soaked, ignored, dismissed, I wasn't just a father betrayed. I was a man preparing to end a dynasty built on pride. The morning after the gala arrived with the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. Not thunder, not wind. Just a stillness so deep it feels like the world is holding its breath. I woke before sunrise, not from restlessness, but from clarity. The manila envelope sat on my kitchen table, untouched since the night before. The evidence was no longer just documentation. It had become a threshold. Crossing it meant accepting that the boy I'd raised, the boy who once held my hand walking home from school, had chosen someone else's values over mine. Justice required action. And action required finality. By noon, I was standing in the downtown precinct, the envelope in my hands, my heart steady. The officer at the counter read through the documents with the blank professionalism of someone who processes ruins every day. When he looked up, his expression had changed, sharper, more respectful. "This is solid," he said. "We'll open an investigation." A simple sentence, but one that shifted the ground beneath all of us. Once the report entered the system, it couldn't be ignored. Not by the police, not by the courts, and certainly not by the institutions the Bennetts had built their pride on. The first crack in their fortress appeared just 48 hours later. Gregory Bennett, senior partner at Bennett, Whitaker and Ames, received a formal notification from the licensing board. A complaint had been filed, not against him, but against his daughter's fiancé, my son. Theft under a professional workplace. Misappropriation of funds. A pattern of misconduct. Under normal circumstances, the allegation would have stayed quiet while the investigation unfolded. But the Bennetts had enemies, people waiting for even a hint of vulnerability. Within hours, rumors spread across the legal community like wildfire. Court clerks whispered. Attorneys raised eyebrows. Partners convened emergency meetings behind glass walls. Gregory's world, the world he believed was unshakable, had begun to tilt. He stormed into the restaurant 2 days later, flanked by 2 associates, his face the color of rage barely contained. "You went too far," he hissed, jabbing a finger toward me. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I said nothing. Words were unnecessary. "You could have handled this privately," he continued. "But no, you had to drag us into your family's dysfunction." Family's dysfunction. As if his daughter hadn't orchestrated half of it. As if his wife hadn't humiliated me in front of 200 people. I looked directly at him. Calm, steady. "You raise a daughter who thinks other people's money belongs to her. My son believed her. I corrected my son's mistake." He flinched, not at the words, but at the truth inside them. When Gregory left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, I knew he understood. The ground beneath him was slipping, and he couldn't stop it. But the real shockwave didn't come for him. It came for Catherine. The Judicial Commission, quiet, watchful, meticulous, had been observing her conduct for months. Complaints had been filed before, whispers about her bias, her sharp tongue, her cruel treatment of those she considered beneath her. But the gala incident had been recorded, publicly, clearly. A donor posted it online, the red wine spilling, her taunting words, the guard confronting me, and within hours it reached the ethics board. A retired federal judge humiliating a guest, making class-based insults, abusing her influence in a public space. It was the kind of scandal the commission did not forgive. She received the letter 3 days after the gala. A formal review, a meeting with investigators, a request for testimony. Her reputation, the identity she worshipped, fractured like thin glass. Serafina called me next. Her tone was frantic, trembling, stripped of the polished arrogance she once wore like perfume. "I didn't think it would go this far," she whispered. I wanted Daniel to have more. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." For a moment, I heard sincerity. Not manipulation. Not entitlement. Just a young woman crushed under the weight of her own choices. But remorse doesn't rewind consequences. "You encourage him to steal," I replied softly, "and you watched him lose himself." She cried, real tears, messy and human. But pain does not erase damage. Not when the seeds were planted with such deliberate intent. Her next sentence, though, revealed everything. Please don't destroy my family." I closed my eyes. They had destroyed themselves. And Daniel, my son, watched it unfold from the shadows, realizing too late the cost of aligning himself with people who saw him as useful, not loved. The investigation accelerated. The licensing board suspended Gregory's firm pending review. Investors pulled out. Clients demanded answers. 2 partners resigned within a week. The Bennetts, once a towering family of law, influence, and polished respectability, were now the center of a scandal that grew darker by the hour. Their name, once spoken with pride, became a cautionary whisper. Then came the breaking point. Daniel received his notice. The one no parent wants their child to face. Formal charges for workplace theft. Not a trial yet, but a legal mark that would follow him everywhere. He came to my house the night he received it. He didn't knock. He didn't shout. He simply stood in the doorway, shoulders shaking, his pride stripped away like old paint. "Dad," he said, voice cracking. "I didn't think it would get this bad." I looked at him, my son, the child I once carried on my shoulders, the teenager who begged me for extra fries after his shift, the man who now stood in front of me lost and broken. "I tried to warn you," I said quietly. I tried to fix this before it reached anyone else. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. I thought Serafina's parents knew best, he whispered. They told me you'd hold me back. They said I deserved more. I believed them. That sentence, I believed them, was the deepest cut of all. Because love cannot compete with power when someone convinces you power is your birthright. I didn't reach for him. I didn't speak. I simply let the silence settle between us, not as punishment, but as truth. He had chosen, and choices carry weight. Not forever, but for now. The next day, the Bennett's downfall became public record. Newspapers printed the story. Judges shook their heads. Lawyers whispered in hallways. Social invitations disappeared. Their empire, once tall, polished, and untouchable, had crumbled in less than 10 days. A dynasty built on entitlement had finally met the reckoning it deserved. And I, a man they once reduced to kitchen help, had not lifted a single finger in vengeance. I had simply told the truth. There's a strange silence that comes after the storm. Not peace, not relief, but a heavy, echoing stillness, like the world trying to understand what survived and what didn't. That was the silence that settled around me in the weeks following the Bennett's collapse. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was simply the sound of consequences settling into the spaces where arrogance once lived. The restaurant went on as they always had. Breakfast crowds still filed in. Servers still laughed in the break rooms. The smell of rosemary chicken and toasted bread still drifted through the air. But inside me, something had shifted. A weight I didn't know I carried. Decades of fatherhood, sacrifice, hope, and disappointment had finally settled into the shape of acceptance. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. One evening, I sat alone in my office at the flagship location, the hum of the refrigerators in the background, the soft golden light pooling on the wooden desk where I had signed every contract that built my life. I stared at the empty space where I once pictured Daniel sitting across from me as my successor, a future that now no longer existed. I made the decision quietly, without ceremony. It was time to let go. 2 days later, I met with my attorney and listed every property, every business, every asset for sale. All 12 restaurants, the catering service, the warehouses, the delivery fleet, the event hall, even the land I'd purchased as a retirement fantasy but never used. I wasn't leaving out of bitterness. I wasn't running away. I was simply closing a story that had reached its final chapter. My attorney looked at me with confusion when she saw the numbers. Are you sure? This is a legacy. You can pass this on. I nodded, the decision already carved into stone. A legacy only matters if the one inheriting it understands its cost. Mine didn't. Within a month, the papers were signed. My empire, the one I built from a food truck and a dream, no longer belonged to me. I walked through each restaurant one last time, touching the counters, the booze, the walls. Memories clung to everything. My wife wiping down tables when we couldn't afford staff. Daniel wiping flour off his nose when he was a child. Couples celebrating anniversaries. Birthdays. Countless strangers who had made my food part of their lives. Letting go hurt, but it didn't break me. Some endings arrive without bitterness. Some goodbyes are simply necessary. But even after selling everything, one thing remained constant. The letters. The first came from Serafina. A simple envelope. No perfume. No rehearsed elegance. Just her handwriting. Shaky, uneven, very human. In it, she apologized. Not the polished apologies shaped to protect reputation, but a raw, trembling confession. She wrote about the pressure of growing up in a family where success was required, not owned. Where love was conditional, where every step was measured, where every mistake was hidden under layers of pride. She wrote about envying the relationship I had with my son, the softness, the warmth, the easy affection. She admitted she pushed Daniel to take from me because she believed he deserved what she never received from her own father, unconditional support. But she also said something that stayed with me long after the paper was folded back into its envelope. I confused entitlement with love because I was raised to think they were the same. I didn't write back, not out of anger, out of understanding. She needed to write it more than I needed to read it. The second letter came from Daniel. I hesitated for a long time before opening it. His handwriting was messy, rushed, like someone who had finally run out of places to hide. He wrote about the investigation, the legal counseling, the humiliation, the Bennetts turning cold and distant the moment scandal touched them. He wrote about sitting alone in his apartment, realizing that the people he had chosen over his own father had vanished the moment he stopped being useful. But the line that cut the deepest was this: "I thought growing meant leaving your shadow. I didn't understand that your shadow was where I learned to stand." For the first time in months, I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a softening, a familiar ache of a parent who has wanted nothing more than for his child to find his way. He ended his letter with a question: "Is there a path back to you?" I didn't answer immediately. Some wounds need time to close. Some lessons must settle before forgiveness can begin. But I kept the letter, and that was its own kind of answer. The Bennetts, meanwhile, had faded from the world they once dominated. Gregory's firm dissolved under the weight of investigations and fleeing clients. Catherine retreated from public life entirely, her name now synonymous with scandal and cruelty. Serafina, caught between love and loyalty, had begun rebuilding her life from the fragments left behind. Their empire had turned to ash, not because of me, but because their values had hollowed it long before I arrived. One afternoon, weeks later, I stood at the cliffs overlooking the coast. The wind was sharp, carrying the smell of salt and the distant crash of waves. I closed my eyes and let the world breathe around me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about consequences or betrayal or justice. I was thinking about peace. Not the kind you find in revenge. The kind you find in release. I had walked through humiliation, betrayal, and loss. I had watched empires fall. I had buried dreams I once held close. And yet, standing there on the cliff edge, the horizon stretching endlessly before me, I realized something simple and profound. I had survived all of it without losing myself. Respect, real respect, is not given by others. It is reclaimed by choosing who you refuse to become. I took a slow breath, letting the wind carry away the remnants of everything that once weighed me down. My story wasn't about destroying the Bennetts. It wasn't even about punishing my son. It was about understanding the cost of silence, the price of integrity, and the moment a man finally decides he is done shrinking for the comfort of others. The storm had passed. The ashes had settled. And in their place, a quiet, steady beginning.